Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brian Kessman. I'm the head of business strategy here at Litho, and I'd like to, again, thank you all for joining today's webinar topic about the marketing costs of bad briefs, a deep dive into why marketing briefs fail, the real costs, and how to turn it around. And here to talk about the topic is our special guests, Australian strategists and BetterBriefs Project co-founders, Matt Davies and Pieter-Paul von Weiler. So they're going to walk us through their key findings from their recently released first global research study on marketing briefs, which surveyed over 1,700 respondents from 70 countries. But before we get going, I want to share why I'm so excited about this particular topic. Well, first, if you're not familiar with Litho, our North Star as an organization is to help our customers achieve better content outcomes. And we do this by providing workflow and DAM software built around the best practices for the needs of creative and brand teams. And with our combined DAM and workflow solutions, our customers can tame any feelings of chaos across the content lifecycle and begin to develop better client relationships, better work, and brand consistency. And that largely starts with the creative brief, but that's easier said than done, right? Which is, of course, why we have Matt and Pieter-Paul here to help. One last note before I hand it over to them, and that is they'd love to answer your questions. And so at any point throughout our session today, please use the chat box at the very bottom of your control panel to submit your questions, and they'll aim to answer them during the session. So with that, Matt and Pieter-Paul, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for the kind intro and invitation, Brian and Litho. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone from all over the world. We are coming to you from live from Melbourne today, where it's early morning. And Matt and I are agency strategists. We have worked in Europe, we've worked in APAC, and we've worked on local and global brands in big network agencies and for local independent agencies. We believe that organizations invest in marketing to drive better business results. That's one of our grounding beliefs as strategists, and we love demonstrating marketing effectiveness. And over beers, I'm not going to lie here, it was late March last year, Matt and I were pondering why there are so many bad briefs in the world. And we started to ask ourselves, why after 40 years of decent marketing effectiveness case studies of the FEs and the IPAs, why is there still so much bad input going into agencies? And the first thing we did was look at research. And what really surprised us, that very little research had been done on the topic, on what we think is the most important document in marketing that exchanges hands between brands and agencies. Well, we know that the IPA did some research back in 2003. They did a full study on briefs, and that study painted quite a bleak picture of what was going on at that time. However, that study was only limited to the UK and had a quite modest sample size. In the Netherlands, SWOC, which is part of Amsterdam University, did a really excellent literature study, but unfortunately, it's only available in Dutch, my home country. And then in the US, the ANA, and on a global scale, the WFA, they did some studies on client-agency relationships, and those studies included some questions on briefs. But again, you'll see quite modest respondent numbers. And that's it. The most important document in marketing was very lightly researched. And we decided to do something about that. So we thought it was important to fill in this knowledge gap, because we wanted to understand why some briefs fail and why others actually succeed. And we thought it was really important to bring some objectivity into this quite subjective discussion. Everybody always looks at this stuff from a subjective and own agency and own brand perspective, and bringing some objectivity and producing some neutral facts. We believe that we could generate some more and help generate some more objective conversations about briefs and hopefully make them better. However, we could not do that alone. Guys, I'm on a webinar. So we decided to partner up with a research agency, and that research agency was called Flood & Partners. And I've been working with them for quite a long time, and their approach to research is very different compared to traditional researchers. The way they ask questions is far more intuitive than traditional surveys, and their methodology really taps into your system one direct unconscious part of your brain. So no Likert skills, no over-rationalization here. And you'll see some examples of the questions that we actually asked. So some of the things we got people to do is give their immediate response and get them to swipe left and right, almost like it was a dating app. Or if you really agreed with something, you're asked to press a button for a longer period of time. So the longer you press, the more you agree with it. So their methodology is increasingly being recognized as a new and better way to capture what people are really thinking. And it really helped us create a survey and a piece of research that captures people's true opinions and hidden feelings when it comes down to briefs. And we could not have done it with the help of a whole bunch of partners to help us get respondents. So we reached out to a bunch of trade organizations and publications to get help. And it was really interesting to see their hunger for the topic. And they all believed in the cause. And as a collective, we really got to a great number of respondents. Matt, over to you.
Pieter-Paul. Thanks, Pieter-Paul. To dive into that sample in a little bit more detail, as you can see, it's really the first truly global sample into this particular topic. We had 1,730 respondents from over 70 countries, and we had a really good respondent numbers from the US, the UK, and Australia in particular. So three prominent English-speaking markets. What's interesting about this sample is that we had a really good spread of experience, seniority. So from people who've had 20 years experience right through to people who have 1 or 2 years experience, we're able to statistically validate those experience levels. We had a really high number of respondents from marketing organizations. So it wasn't just creative agencies, venting their frustrations with briefs or anything like that. We had a real appetite for a marketing organization and people that work in those organizations to understand where these briefs were falling down and how to then make them better. So we had people from a varying sizes of marketing departments. 20% of our sample came from people who work in marketing departments of over 50 people. So again, we're really confident in our sample and being able to draw really conclusive results and findings from it as well. Before we dive into the results, I just wanted to touch on a really brief glossary of terms, Pieter-Paul, if you click to the next slide. So every time you see data presented in orange, it reflects the views of a marketer. And in our instance, we're talking about those people who write briefs, contribute to briefs, and also approve briefs, because we know that brief writing doesn't happen on an island. It involves people within an organization. So we wanted to capture responses from all those involved with briefs. Anytime you see data reflected in that light blue color, it represents the views of creative agencies. So within that, account managers, strategists, and creatives, anyone who touches a brief is responsible for responding to it or interpreting it, and again, that is different depending on which agency you work for and their particular structure. We also want to focus in on just the marketing brief. So the marketing brief has many names, sometimes called the creative agency brief, the communications brief. There are many names, and maybe that's a learning in its own right, that actually getting that terminology consistent across the world is a big battle in itself. But we wanted to focus in on the document that goes from the brand to the creative agency, not the document that's developed by the creative agency internally. So we wanted to really focus on that transfer of information that happens from brand to agency. So without further ado, let's jump into the results. The results are structured in 3 parts. So this first part will explore the problem as it came through the survey. The second part is really exploring the impact of that problem. So what is it? What is it? You know, how's it manifesting itself? And the third part is really finding some solutions or a way forward, some things that we can start to do to try and make briefs better. So the first part of this, I'm going to start with some of the data points in which we, I guess, strongly agree as 2 parties. So both parties, both marketers, brand owners, and agencies agree that the briefs are important, that it's hard to produce good work without a good brief. And this is really why we focused on briefs as that first input document. You know, it's where marketing investment is turned into creative work that is either effective in market or not. So for this, to get an understanding of whether a brief is important in producing good work was again, I guess, a validation for us on why we did this particular piece of research. We also found that despite their importance and that we agree they're really important, they're also paradoxically the most neglected tools marketers have to create good work. So both marketers and creative agencies agree that they're really important, but they're also really neglected. How often do we say, oh, yeah, I'll get to that brief. Yes, you know, I'll bang out that brief tomorrow morning before everyone gets into the office. There is not enough time and attention placed on briefs, despite the fact that we know how important they are. So again, a really kind of paradoxical problem that we face here. And part of that, I guess, is that, and maybe we put it off, Pieter-Paul, if you go to the next slide, is that we recognize, both sides recognize that writing briefs is hard. It is a tough thing. You know, you have to define your strategy, you have to align the organization, you have to manage stakeholders, and that's before you've even put pen to paper on a brief. So, you know, to get all that information and distill it in the right way and then communicate that to an agency, it's tough going, and we recognize that. So again, what we're going to show you is coming from a place where people really recognize that it's important, but really recognize that it's a tough skill to master. And if you go on to the next slide, Pieter-Paul, actually, as we have more experience as brand owners and marketers, we think that it gets harder, or we recognize that it's harder. So we know how much information, how critical that information is to produce the work off the back of it. So this is representative data from marketers with varying levels of experience in terms of the years or their tenure. So we know that with marketers for 15 plus or years of experience, 84% of them feel that briefs are hard to write. So again, it's a really interesting kind of trend line in how important we think briefs are. If you go to the next slide, Pieter-Paul, we also had a look at this geographically as well, just to see whether there are any differences in those key markets. And in the US, more marketers have indicated that they think writing briefs is really tough, more so than us in Australia. I'm not sure if that's just our laid back attitude, and she'll be right, mate. But again, we think that that's interesting to see that there's not a lot of differences between markets when it comes to how difficult we think this document is to write. So that's probably the end of the agreement between the 2 parties. I'm going to hand over to Pieter-Paul, who's going to take you through some stark findings.
Thanks, Matt. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where the alignment ends. What you can see here is that the majority of marketeers, 8 in 10 marketeers, think that they're good at writing briefs. However, only 1 in 10 of the agencies agree with that statement. So massive lack of alignment here, and we need to be really careful how we read this, because it is so easy to now say, oh, marketers are doing a really shit job at this. We need to take a balanced approach here. We have to ask ourselves the question, why is there such big difference in opinion? Why is the lack of alignment so large? And agencies might think their clients, the brands, are not good at writing briefs. However, are they giving that feedback to their clients? Are they speaking up? And we're finding that in most cases, they aren't speaking up. They're just saying yes to a brief, accepting the brief, taking it back to the agency, and then they start to complain about it. And at the same time, are clients and brands really asking their agencies, internal or external, if their briefs are landing, if those that are getting briefed are really understanding what they're being briefed on? This is us using some historical data from the ANA, and what you can see is over time to 2015 and 2021, marketeers think they're getting better at writing briefs, and agencies think that clients and marketing briefs are getting worse. So in the last 6 years or so, with more and more tools available to marketeers, more and more toys to play with, more and more techniques to apply, there's the alignment and the gap has grown, which we think is a really dangerous development. And when you look at it from a geographic perspective, and when we look at a country level, we're seeing that relatively more marketeers in the US believe that they're good at writing briefs compared to Australia and the UK. We're not going to go into that. We don't want to get ourselves into trouble, but we'll leave that with you to ponder on that one. Now, when it comes down to perceived quality of briefs, let's start with the blue chart on the bottom, and let's focus on the right side. And on the right side, you see that only a quarter of the briefs that agency received, they deem as good enough. 75% of the agency think that the last 3 briefs they got were not good enough, which is super, super concerning. But then when we move to the orange chart on the top, and when we look at that left stat, the 31%, and this fact really intrigued us. 31% of marketeers, that's 1 in 3 marketeers, admit that the last 3 briefs they wrote wasn't good enough. So that really raises the question, why would you send out a brief that you know isn't good enough? And again, let's not jump to conclusions. There might be many reasons, not enough time or others, but it's really problematic behavior, and it's costing a lot of time and money, which we'll get to in a second. Now, instead of us just talking to you guys, we wanted to make this a little bit more interactive. So this stat is about strategy in briefs, and more than 3 in 4 marketers believe that the briefs they write provides clear strategic direction. Now, what we want you to do, we want to hear your opinion, and using the chat box, can you please guess what you think the percentage is of agencies that agree with the statement? The briefs my client writes provides clear strategic direction. So just have a guess, have a play, chuck it in the chat box, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to do that. And while you do that, just some thoughts from us. From our perspective, every marketing brief needs to do 2 basic things. They need to direct and they need to inform. And by direct, we mean to provide clear strategic direction about what needs to be done. What is the big picture and how will the work be measured? Briefs should outline problems that the brand struggles with or commercial opportunity that the brand wants to leverage. And as a result, briefs should make strong and clear strategic directions. So that's direct. By inform, we mean providing the right level of information for those who are taking the brief. So not an information overload or not a 1-sentence brief. Briefs are basically the last step of a long process. It's the last step of a lot of commercial thinking, a lot of marketing strategy thinking, and the brief is almost the summary of all of that thinking. And as a result of that, briefs should be brief. So Matt, what did we get through the chat so I can reveal the answer?
I think you've shocked people, Pieter-Paul, with that first stat. So I think people are a little bit nervous to put their opinion in. So I think you should reveal what that stat is.
All right. Well, there you go. Oh, sorry. So it's actually 5%. So most agencies don't understand what the strategy is in the briefs they're receiving. So if they don't understand what the strategy of the brief is, then everything else kind of falls apart. So we think this is a really concerning situation. All right, let's talk about language. So in marketing, language is our most important tool. However, when it comes to language, marketers and agencies don't even understand each other. Both marketers and agencies are in the business of communication. We are all in the business of communication, but clearly we're not really good at communicating about briefs. We'd like to talk about marketingese. There's too much marketingese, which is this really special language that we as marketers have developed, but it's creating a lot of confusion. If you think about the amount of words that start with the word brand, we once counted it, you get up to about 40 words already. So when you're writing briefs, try and remove all the jargon and all the confusing language that's in there. Just simple, straight, as we like to say, Sesame Street simple language, because briefs will touch so many people. And the more confused and complex language we use, the more risk we have of confusion. And clearly there is too much confusion going on already through language. This was a bit of fun that we had with emojis, and we asked respondents how they feel about marketing or client briefs. And we got respondents to swipe left or right for the emojis you see on the screen. And what we've learned in orange on the left, that marketeers, when asked about client or marketing briefs, they feel pretty positive, they feel excited, they feel energized, they feel even more motivated and satisfied. However, agencies in blue, when you look to the right, they feel much more negative than positive when they start to think about briefs. And what's really concerning is those last two on the right, the levels of the feelings of frustration and irritation. So we call these active negative emotions, and obviously it's not good that even thinking about the topic generates so much negativity. So we want to stop here and maybe and give you a quick opportunity to ask some questions via the chat box. And otherwise, there's a second opportunity at the end of the session. We thought, because this is quite shocking research, we thought we'd just have a quick break here. So I'll give you about 30 seconds, and otherwise we move on to the second part of the presentation.
Yeah, just to give you a second, what we were surprised by these results. These weren't results where we had to run really detailed, significance testing on. That they were, skyscrapers and single house dwellings in their stark difference. So again, this was really surprising for us. We had some clues in that previous research, but the extent of this problem was something that we weren't expecting at all.
So there's a question here. What if part of the reason you're engaging an agency or creative firm is to help clarify a strategy, particularly good KPIs? I find there is a bit of a chicken and egg syndrome. From our perspective, we're quite clear on this. The brand, the client has to be 100% clear on the objectives. And when you think about objectives, there's three types of objectives we want to see in briefs. Commercial objectives. So what's the bigger commercial picture that the project needs to achieve? Those commercial objectives are linked to certain behavior. What's the behavior that you want your core target to do? Is it a click? Is it a download? Is it a sale? Is it an inquiry? And then linked to that behavior, there's an attitude. What's an attitudinal KPI? What's the attitudinal shift that needs to happen in people's brain to achieve and to realize the behavior we want that will drive the commercial result? So those three levels are really linked to each other, and it's down to the client to define them. However, if you're a client, if you're a brand owner, and you're struggling with that last bit, you're struggling with the translation of behavioral goals into attitudinal goals, ask your agency to help set that goal. Don't work in isolation. Briefs shouldn't be a relay race. They should be a scrum.
Thank you, Pieter-Paul. I think it answers that last question too, which is great. And just the one above that, how do we get the two sides on the same page? well, use this report. You can download it at betterbriefs.com and use it as a conversation starter. Say, hey, this isn't us. This is definitely not our relationship. We're working really well together. But things can always improve. But have a look at this disparity between typically what happens between clients and agencies, and have a conversation about these things. Give your agency build a culture of challenge. Allow them to push back, encourage them to push back, force them to push back if you don't, if they're not doing it enough. Because I guess passively sending a brief over or receiving a brief passively is part of this problem as well. So this is a real moment of collaboration that needs to happen. As Pieter-Paul said, yes, whilst it's the marketer's job to distill all that marketing strategy into the brief and communicate that piece of information effectively to their agencies, that's not happening. Work together on that. Make sure that both parties are understanding the language that's going into that brief. We do get caught up in marketing jargon, and to speak simply is really important.
Just 2 more questions and then we'll move on. A really simple call out here. How can we make sure that briefs are clear and simple and concise? I would say get multiple people to read it. Get colleagues to read your brief before you brief it in. Maybe even get your family to read the brief, and they'll pick up on stuff that you probably assume is not problematic. They will pick up on that language side of things. And then, can you share components of a great brief? Can you share an example? Yeah, we might, but it's what you expected. It's objective. We'll get to what's important of a brief later on with some stats on what agencies and client deem the most important components. So we'll answer that.
Yep.
Matt, in case there's anything else, we'll move on.
Let's move on in the interest of time.
Yep.
All right, let's hit this part 2, the impact. And so intuitively, I think we know that time, money and energy is wasted and has been being wasted for a long time now, but we never really knew how much, and we're never able to quantify that until now. So this is something that we can actually put our finger on, and we can start to build into our process. And let's talk about the R word, the rebrief word, because that is a catalyst for a lot of that time, money and energy being wasted. And both sides of the coin agree that rebriefs are happening far too often. Almost 70% of marketers and over 70% of creative agencies think that rebriefs are happening way too often for their liking. We're going to go to another interactive question quickly, and just have a think about this if you don't want to place your thought in the chat. But I want to talk about this, and it came up in one of those questions there. The creative process being used to clarify the marketing strategy is a problem. And marketers admitting to using the creative process to clarify their strategy. So what I mean by that is you put a brief in, you're not really clear exactly on the strategy that you've put in. And so you wait to see creative and the concepts around that to see which direction you want to go down as a brand. And this was a question that was asked back in 2003 by the IPA. And so what we'd like you to do is have a think about what percentage of marketers would admit to doing this, using the creative process to clarify their strategy. So this was a question first asked 2003 by the IPA. So we wanted to get a historical read on this to see if things had improved, if the situation had changed, if less marketers were, I guess, doing this behavior. Not sure if anything is coming through. So let's click on, let's reveal that stat, Pieter-Paul. So unfortunately, what we're seeing is that 6 out of 10 marketers admit to using the creative process to clarify the strategy, 60%. And historically, and this is the global number, but in the UK, that stat sat at around 35% from memory. So again, there's been a worrying trend, increasing trend in marketers doing this. So it's a big watch out that if that strategy is not well defined, then we tend to just have a scattergun approach to creative, and we can pick and choose, and then no one in the organization becomes aligned behind that single direction that we want to take. So what is happening is that a poor brief sets off a negative chain reaction. A poor brief leads to shallow creative thinking because because creatives, it's their nature to want something really specific and really tight, so they can explode off that, so they can explore it in multiple ways. If they've got a number of things that they need to explore, it's just confusing for them. So what they do is they spend less time going deep in solving the problem, and using creativity to solve the problem. They tend to go broad in their thinking. It leads to mediocre ideas. Clients aren't happy with the ideas that come back. We get additional rounds of concepting, approvals. There's more time and money spent, and which are the hard, I guess, costs associated with this. But what we're finding also is that job satisfaction, motivation, staff, and some of those soft variables are starting to are showing a worrying trend as well. Is that people, as soon as they get trapped in this negative cycle, creative isn't hitting the mark, feedback isn't clear. We're starting to get people who are, unfortunately, deciding that this communications industry is not for them, and they're leaving. We're seeing an exodus of talent. And we feel strongly that briefs have a role to play in this, and improving briefs will start to change this vicious cycle that's happening. But I guess on the next slide, what we've uncovered, and we asked a fairly delicate question. And we asked a question around getting people to estimate what percentage of their marketing budgets are being wasted on that vicious cycle that I just spoke about earlier. And that includes not just the brief and rounds of creative and going back and forth between marketer and agency. This is actually the result of then producing poor work that doesn't hit the mark when it's in market as well. So 1/3 of every marketing budget, think about that, in a $1 trillion global advertising industry, 1/3 of every marketing budget is being wasted on poor briefs and misdirected work. So let's not worry about increasing our budgets. Let's worry about that third that we can possibly optimize to start making our budgets work a lot harder for us.
And when we drill down on this to make sure this was all correct, and agencies and marketers weren't too far apart when it came down to this estimate. Agencies were sitting at about 37%, brands were sitting at about 30%. So kind of we were surprised about the alignment there. And we're just going to leave you with this thought: what about if you could make 1/3 of your budget work harder? If you get 1/3 of your budget extra. So that's all the bad news so far. It will be dismissive of us not to talk about some ways and have some thoughts on how to make things better, and that's what we're going to do in this third and last section. So first up, let's talk about the length of a brief, and let's make sure that the briefs we all write are succinct. Don't make them too long. So we're seeing in the lower bar chart on the right that the agencies that who are receiving the briefs think that that half of the briefs they receive are too long. However, be careful not to make them too short either, because 1/3 of the briefs are too short. Make sure you cover all the basic information that's needed. One of the things we train people on is you've got the brief itself. That has to be short and succinct and brief. But if you got additional information, put it all in the appendix. That's where it belongs. So the brief has to be very choiceful and has to be a summary of the strategy. All of the extra information, agencies are interested in receiving that extra information, but be really clear that it's extra information and it isn't part of the core brief, which should only reflect decisions. Let's talk about motivation. So we talked about strategy. When briefs contain a really clear strategy, when agencies are clear on the strategy that is being briefed in, that has a direct impact on motivation. People in creative agencies are twice as motivated to work on briefs with clear strategies. So that will mean that your brief will go to the top of the pile and people will fight over it to work on it, rather than being dismissed and you get the B team working on those briefs. And there was a question about this earlier. Can you talk about the key components of a marketing brief? Let's just focus on one thing, and that's the objectives. Currently, what we're seeing is that the most important thing that brands think are in briefs are the objectives. But look at the agencies. Look in blue. The agencies are really screaming out for clear objectives. So if there's one thing we need to nail, it's that. Just to answer the question that was being asked before, objectives, target, and message are the key components. The insight, not as much, because the agency will come up with some creative insight further down the line. Hopes that it answers that question, and make sure that objectives are linked, and ensure that linkage between commercial, behavioral, and attitudinal objectives. And that's what we really train people on as well.
This is Pieter-Paul. So the other thing that we're finding is that marketers are wanting to bring more structure to the process. They feel like their agency briefings could work better if they were more structured. So this is, and some of the open ends here are, rather than just sending a brief across via email and leaving the agency to respond in a few days, actually, how do we bring in the agency into, behind the scenes into that process? What happens after the brief? What sort of response is the agency afforded before that brief is finalized? How is that information and shared understanding gained, basically? So we know that almost 3/4 of marketers think that more structure should be added to the process. So not just the briefing document, but the ceremony around it. And that's what we like to call it. It is a ceremony, and that's where that inspiration really should come from for the agency is how do you immerse them in your business, not just words on a paper, but ensure that they're really, really inspired to work on the project that you're briefing them on. The next thing, and it is, well, from the outside, it seems like an easy fix anyway, if you click onto the next slide, Pieter-Paul, is that half the time, the right people aren't signing off marketing briefs internally. So 1 in 2 briefs that goes across the agency, the right people haven't seen it on the marketing side. So if they haven't seen the brief or have not signed off on the brief, then once they see work, they're saying, well, what is this work being judged against? Where is the criteria for that? And they're kind of starting from a dark spot in this instance. So again, just getting the right people involved in the process, getting the right people signing off the brief. And yes, this is a tricky art, and this is stakeholder management at its hardest. So we don't say that this is necessarily easy, but it's something to be aware of, that getting the right people signing off the brief can go a long way to ensuring that that process is smoothed out. And the next, surprising stat, and this is not available in the free report, but is that many marketers haven't actually been trained. So they've had no or very little training in writing marketing briefs. We like to think the Australian Open is on here in Melbourne at the moment, and we like to think of our profession having the same professional standards as tennis players, or someone in the army, or or a doctor, a surgeon, who would continually update and train their skills. So it's really, really surprising that people have not ever been trained in what we think is the most critical document that transfers between a brand and an agency. And in the US, you can see 46% of people have had very, very little training in brief writing in particular. So I guess to sum all that up, there's a lot there. And again, as Pieter-Paul mentioned, this is, reading the report by yourself, you may think that this is, this is a dig at one side or the other. But again, these are learnings that both sides need to really, really take out for us. So marketers, yes, it's really important to be clear on your strategies, use clear and simple language. Don't send briefs to your agencies that you're not happy with. We're seeing that almost 1/3 of those briefs are not up to standard, but they're still getting sent across. Again, hopefully what this report does is allows you to push back against those time pressures, against those internal pressures that you're feeling, and say, no, it's really important that we get this brief right, because it's going to save us so much time, energy, and effort on the back end. It sounds simple, but again, prioritizing briefs is a really important behavior that we need to start to implement within our organizations as well. And creative agencies, this is about not being silent. Do not be passive in this process. You are not just a recipient. A brief does not become a contract until it's agreed upon by both parties. A contract, that's a contract by its very nature. If you were signing an employment contract, you wouldn't sign it until you were happy with the terms. So again, it is not a contract until both parties are happy. So clarify what's unclear. It's really the agency's responsibility too to push back, and for us to create a culture of collaboration, of being able to question each other, and making sure that we're getting what we need out of briefs. Because we know that in the end, better briefs do drive better business results. We can see that from how we quantify that. So a lot of information. I know. Pieter-Paul, maybe over to you, or do you want me to? So one way that you can make briefs better is.
Yeah. So there's three ways how you can make briefs better. And the first way is to go to betterbriefs.com and download our report. It's available for free. And you can use that to sit your agency down or sit your client down and have a bit of a conversation. Hey, there's these two weird guys from Australia that wrote this outrageous report. Of course, our relationship is way stronger than that. But hey, let's just have a chat about our briefs and use it as a bit of conversation starter. We also offer some short courses how to write better briefs, and that's just one side of the coin. Another side of the coin is that you actually have to understand how you evaluate creative ideas. That's almost even trickier than writing briefs because there's so much personal bias comes in, and so many brands haven't got criteria in place how to evaluate and how to assess creative ideas. And thirdly, if you get really stuck, what we do a lot is we build custom designed training programs for brands, for agencies, and even for trade organizations. So those are three things how you can get to better briefs with our help. What we wanted to do now, before we go into Q&A, is one last exercise via the chat box before the Q&A, and we wanted to hear from you. We wanted you to think about what's the question that's on the screen here. Why do you think we had so much misalignment? Why are our brands and agencies so misaligned? From your own personal experience, what are some reasons why this is happening? And we would love to hear from you, from what's your perspective on this. And we'll do that for about 3 minutes, and then we'll go over to the Q&A. So
while we wait, I just wanted to say thanks again. This has been such fantastic data. There is a response that came in here, different focuses and mindsets as one. Here's a longer one. It's referencing Donald Miller's books about marketing, claiming many people fail because they just don't get started. Sometimes I just need to get started, and sometimes that means my work isn't perfect for the moment, but it's good enough, right? So just trying to get it out the door, right? Here's another, because brands do not understand and therefore do not respect the process.
Yeah, and there's two parts to that, right? There's when you engage in a new relationship between a client and a brand, I think both parties have a responsibility to sit down with each other and say, how we're going to brief each other. It's the agency that can initiate that, or it's the brand that can initiate that. I've been lucky enough to work with Diageo. Diageo took our teams out for 2 days. We spent 2 entire days just getting trained on how Diageo would like to brief us. And as a result of that, we had a much better understanding of what they were briefing in and how they went about their briefing. So just a thought.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's another. I think misalignment comes from unclear strategies from the marketing side, pressure on timelines and starting projects with creative as soon as possible, right? Trying to deal with the short timelines there. Brands may feel spending too much time on the brief is doing the agency's work for them rather than helping them do better work. Okay. Yeah, there's quite a few here. Marketing strategy is really hard, and it's easier to focus on prescriptive art direction, right?
Yeah, I love that. You go, man.
Yeah, just to comment on that as well, is that the brief isn't the start of the marketing strategy, right? And I'm sure everyone knows that here. So the brief is the summary of the thinking, and it's pulling out a key moment in that strategy and saying we need to focus on this, and this is the part that communications can solve. So if the marketing strategy has been done, then actually writing a brief becomes more straightforward. But if you're relying on the brief to be your strategy, then rather than the distillation and moment of communication, then it becomes difficult.
Mm-hmm. Here's another point. I think why there's misalignment is because there is the pressure to please and say yes, right? Learning how to push back is a skill that can be difficult to master. But it's so important, right? Because that's how you truly become a good partner, right? With the rest of the group.
And it's scary, right? It's COVID times. A lot of agencies are scared. A lot of agencies are scared of losing their client or of losing budget. So they just want to please and accept the brief, make some money, rather than what the right partner should be doing. No, I don't get this brief. What are you saying? But invite that feedback, check in with them, giving them the opportunity to be honest about the brief if stuff is not clear.
We're very cognizant of the internal struggles as well. We had one verbatim which opened our eyes to that internal struggle probably more than anything, which was around, the complexity of managing internal stakeholders, the complexity of massaging people's views into the way that actually that you think the marketing can solve the problem. And lots of people within organizations don't have marketing backgrounds. Their personal opinion drives a lot of their feedback and their interest and whatever it is. So again, yes, it is really difficult, and I don't envy that position of a lot of people.
Sure, yeah. Here's another agency point of view. In our case, as an agency, I believe that our clients think that it's our job to write briefs and have them approved, rather than viewing this as a collaborative process, right? Where clients can provide that strategic direction too, and working together to get there.
Yeah, it's a scrum, not a relay race. Download the report, sit your agency, sit your client down, and work it through together. I think that's the first step in honest conversation.
Should we keep going through a few of these, or should we hop over to Q&A? Should I keep reading? Yeah.
Yeah, just sounds super rich, to be honest with you.
Yeah. So we've become more siloed in our work. It's amazing how much more collaborative we can be when it's face-to-face, although working remotely through COVID has certainly proved that face-to-face collaboration has a different level of synergy. And so some challenges there due to the current environment. Right? Let's see, also this relates to training and mentorship, lack of mentorship and training on the client side. So agency point of view, it sounds like, right? Senior level marketing execs haven't been trained or don't know how to write a good brief, things that you've already touched on as well, right?
Yeah, and it's weird, right? There is, when you go to even when you go to marketing school, how we learn how to write briefs is mostly by on-the-job training and copying or learning from the briefs that are already in place and written by a more senior person, especially when it comes down to brands and clients. And back to that training step, that's where we really need to think. And let's not make it too heavy as well. Let's have some fun with it. I invite you all to just look at some good advertising, because there's a lot of bad advertising. Have a good look at the good advertising you see, and think back. What was the brief? What are they trying to do commercially? What are they trying to do attitudinally? What was the brief there? And the more you practice that muscle, the faster and the better and the sharper your strategies will get. Maybe we'll move into Q&A now. Maybe Brian wrap up the thoughts and I invite everyone for some general questions if there are any.
Great. Yep. So again, please submit those through the panel here. We'll read off the questions. All right, here's one. Do you have any examples of good briefs that ask the right questions, or some examples of the specific questions marketers should be answering and asking?
I guess from my personal experience, the first thing I look at when I receive a brief, and as a strategist having worked in the industry for a while now and dealing with thousands of briefs, I go straight to the objectives box. And the question that I ask is does that ladder of objectives, so we talked about commercial objectives, what are the behaviors that we're trying to drive, what are the behavioral objectives that are going to help us achieve those commercial objectives, and what are the attitudes or shifts in people's brains that we need to achieve to help them or to nudge them towards that behavior to then ladder up to the commercial objectives. If that ladder of objectives is sound, if that's providing a spine for your brief, then that's what I look for, and I will ask questions. I will ask a million questions around those objectives and trying to get those as tight as possible. Specific questions is hard because there are millions of, there are different types of briefs, but always starting with that spine of the brief and understanding, are they linked? Do they make sense together? Do you have enough detail in them? Are they measurable? Are they time specific? Questions like that around objectives become really important.
And maybe maybe turn this into questions. There's only 3 types of commercial briefs. There's only 3 angles or 3 routes you can take. Are we selling more to our existing clients, or are we trying to get new clients and sell to them, or are we trying to upsell and sell a more expensive version of whatever it is we're selling? Those are the only 3 commercial objectives you have. And if there's any non-for-profit brands on the phone, there's only 2 types of things that your briefs are about, which is get people to do more of something, exercise more, eat healthier, or get them to stop demonstrating certain behavior, which is stop smoking or do eating bad food. And that will have a commercial objective link to it, as in saving to the health system per capita, for example. So there's only 3 commercial objectives. That's it. Make it that simple.
Well, here's a really important question, which is, who should own the brief ultimately?
So who should own the client or the marketing brief? Of course, is the client. In some cases, there's no need, there's no time or no space for a creative brief, but we always need a marketing or a client brief as a starting point. So that is owned by the client, by the brand. Then the agency can choose to have a creative brief. We recommend for ideation project, when an idea is needed, to definitely have a creative brief. That is a leap. That is a bit of a step in between ideation and the marketing brief. But start with the marketing brief. Start with the client brief, and brands own that 100%, unless Matt disagrees, but that's very clear to me.
I'm 100% behind you, Pieter-Paul.
Thank you.
All right, so here is another. So what advice would you give to people who are just starting off in the world of creating briefs? I work in an in-house company, so our clients are ones from all over the organization. And for a lot of them, the word creative brief is new entirely. So any advice that I could extend to help them?
Read as many good briefs as you can get your hands on. The more you read inside and outside your category, the more you get a knack for what good looks like and what bad looks like. And then keep it simple. When it comes down to the creative brief, so today we've all been talking about the client or the marketing brief, but when it comes down to the creative brief, the 3 most important components are insight, message, and reasons to believe. That's what creative minds really look for. But this is a different topic, so let's stick with marketing and client brief.
Sure. Well, related to that, do you have any sources for example briefs? Any good briefs that you can point to? Did we ask that one earlier, perhaps? Go ahead.
Yeah, so anything from the APG, the Account Planning Group, or the biggest chapter sits in the UK, anything on work.com, anything from the FE case studies, anything from IPA effectiveness case studies. All of those sources and case studies will contain briefs, and will give you examples.
Well, let's take one more here before we start to wrap up, and this is, who is best suited to do brief training? I think to go through the brief training in an organization, marketers or creatives? And I believe this is referenced in-house, it says.
Yeah, we think.
Yeah, so we actually like to do.
You go, Matt.
We actually think both benefit because, again, it's a two-way street, right? So the marketers who need to know what ingredients go into a brief and how to craft a brief, but then on the flip side, the creatives need to know what to look for in a brief as well. How do they then turn that into something that they can use? How do they then question what's missing or where they should focus if they're not sure what to look for as well. So we actually think that it benefits both sides, and actually sometimes doing it together with your client, it may sound weird, and in-house especially, doing it together with that marketing team allows you to have that shared understanding really quickly about, you know, what it is one is sending and what is one is receiving.
Excellent. All right, I'll do one more. Sometimes there are revisions with the brief between marketers and designers. How can we minimize those revisions?
Look, one of the stats that we found and it's in the report actually that we didn't present today, but is that 9 in 10 times briefs do change once they're briefed in. It is the nature of organizations, and things do evolve and adapt, and they're dynamic. I think as long as everything is brought back to those objectives and the marketing strategy that's been set, then at least there's a foundation. And then shifts in that, you know, because you know, the competitive environment changes really quickly. Your e-commerce platform changes really quickly. You can see a need that you need to solve. That's just the environment in which we work, and we need to account for that. So, you know, a brief being final and not changing it is a rarity. But again, if there's shared understanding and open lines of communication, then you can adapt to that really quickly.
And I would say, outside of the brief, being super clear on your idea assessment criteria. So if they're fixed, and if there is a decent brief, even though that brief changes, you still have fixed criteria what you need to deliver. So if the circumstances change, if a competitor comes out with something, you need to be able to adapt. And with that's the irony, with the stronger, more fixed brief in combination with idea assessment criteria, you're better able to adapt to to changing market conditions.
Yeah, all right. Well, listen, thank you so much for this. Thanks for the report. There's so much great data in there. The one that, you know, is hard to ignore, though, of course, is the 1/3 of marketing budgets being wasted as a result of this. So many other great data points in there as well. It's reassuring, though, to hear that marketers are certainly aware of the challenge and looking for more structure and to improve their ways as well. So, so thanks again, and just a reminder to everybody to head over to the BetterBriefs website to download the full report. We're also going to be sending out a link to today's recording in an email as well. And so that'll do it for today. So Matt, Pieter-Paul, thanks so much, and thank you everyone for hanging out with us today. Take care.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.